Still says stream starting. Morning, everyone. Just to let you know, I'm just keeping an eye on numbers, so I'm just waiting for others to join. So just bear with us just for a short time, just till we see if others are going to join in. Right, that's great. I think we are okay to kick off. Looks like everyone has joined us. So good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar today, which is part of Dying Matters Awareness Week. On the next slide, I'm just going to pull up a quote from a leaflet, one of the Dying Matters leaflets. I won't read it out. Because all of the resources are available on the Dying Matters website, so please do take a look at those. But I think it really succinctly summarises how we tend to think about death, dying and bereavement. We feel quite uncomfortable about talking about it. And Dying Matters Awareness Week is all about changing those perceptions and trying to open up the conversation around that. And so that's why we're holding this webinar today, to try and open up that conversation. So on the next slide, it sets out the 5 steps to this year's campaign. And the campaign this year is focusing on being in a good place to die. And the 5 steps are set out in the slide. So firstly, it's suggested that you write your will and make sure that's up to date. Secondly, record your funeral wishes, and even better if you can, talk about your funeral wishes with your loved ones. Plan your future care and support, and that's quite general, so we'll go into that in a bit more detail. Consider organ donation, and that can be part of the will writing process. And then the 5th one, tell your loved ones about your wishes. So really all of those encompassed in the final step of trying to open up that conversation with your loved ones, because it really will ease the burden of grief and loss after you die. So on the next slide, we've got the panel today. So just some brief introductions. I'm Karen Speedy, Associate Director, Head of Tax and Estate Planning at Whitehead Monckton Solicitors. In the middle there, we've got Joe Williamson, founder of Albany Funerals, and then Becca Fuzzard, my colleague at Whitehead Monckton. For those of you who aren't already aware about Whitehead Monckton, just to let you know, we're a long-established firm of solicitors. We've been around for over 240 years, and we've always been experienced in the matter of wills and tax planning and powers of attorney. So we've got a great deal of experience in dealing with that. We started off with an office in Maidstone, and then we added Tenterden, Canterbury, London, and now with the video call, we're being able to meet with clients from all over the country. So it's been a real benefit actually to the way that we've changed the way that we work. Just a little bit about Joe. So Joe is owner and company director of Albany Funerals, and Joe's going to talk us through how we can start to think about our own funeral and discuss it with our loved ones to ease their burden and grief after we die. But firstly, we'll hear from Becca Fuzzard, who, as I said, is a solicitor specialising in wills, powers of attorney, court protection work. And Becca will be talking us through wills, powers of attorney, which understandably have been at the forefront of many people's minds in recent times. And lots of people who may have been putting off making a will or power of attorney actually got round and did it over the last year. So if you haven't had a chance to do that, if you want to review your arrangements, please get in touch with either Becca or myself afterwards and continue with that. So that slide there just summarises the agenda. So first, as I said, firstly we'll hear from Becca about writing a will and also planning your future care and support with lasting powers of attorney. Then Jo will talk us through funeral options available to celebrate life. And then at the end, we'll come together with questions and answers and a general panel discussion. So as you can see on your screen, there is a little box where you can type in any questions which may occur to you as we go through. So please do type them in there, and then at the end, we'll go through and have a general discussion. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Becca.
Thank you, Karen. Morning, everyone. So the first thing I want to cover today is writing your will. As I am sure you're all aware, a will is a really important document that sets out what is going to happen when you're no longer with us, when you've died. Studies a few years ago discovered that 60% of the adult population did not have a will in place. That percentage has probably decreased in light of the pandemic, but there'll still be a lot of people out there who haven't got a will in place. Why is this? Why do people not do their wills? Well, a big part of this is culture. As referred to on that earlier slide with the Dying Matters quote, we're not great about talking about death here in the UK. It's not like in Mexico where they have the Day of the Dead and it's very much part of their culture. Here we often shy away from conversations about death, and we use very avoidant language often. So we talk about people having passed away, but them being late, things like that. You will often find that people think that talking about these things and contemplating their own mortality, they think it somehow might bring death around sooner, which of course is not the case at all. Others simply think the conversations will be too upsetting or difficult. But talking about death can be difficult, but it is often much easier than you think it will be. I often find clients who are really nervous to begin with feel so much better once they've had that conversation and they've put plans in place. Other people simply just don't get around to it. It's one of those things, isn't it, where you've got a long list of things you need to do and making a will just doesn't always seem like a priority. Other people are put off by the expense. They might think a professionally drafted will be really expensive, when actually it might not cost as much as you think. And at Whitehead Monckton we do fixed fees, so at least you know what the cost will be before you give your instructions. There's also a lot of people who think their estate will just go to their family anyway, whether they've got a will or not, which isn't the case at all, and something I will touch on a little bit more a bit later. Usually one of the first things we put in a will is funeral wishes. And a survey a few years ago discovered that only 27% of people have talked about their wishes for a funeral. You might just want to include something really simple, such as, I want to be cremated, I want to be buried. But you might want something else in there, like a wish to donate your body to medical science. I had a client the other week who wanted to be buried at sea, which isn't quite so common. You might also put really detailed wishes in there, or refer to a separate letter of wishes which has really detailed instructions for your funeral. And I'm sure Jo's chat a bit later will really inspire you about what you might have at your funeral. If we were in person right now and I had you all in front of me, I'd probably get you to do a little hand raise exercise at the moment. So I'd probably ask you to raise your hand if you've got a valid will in place, and then keep your hand up if you've reviewed it in the last few years and it's up to date. And I wonder how many of you would still have your hands up after those two questions. If you've got a will, I want you to have a little think about it. Who are your executors and trustees? So they'd be the people that deal with everything. So they'd notify everyone of your death, they would get a grant of probate if required, they would make sure your estate is distributed in accordance with your wishes. Do you have professionals or family members or friends as your executors and trustees? If it's been a few years since you did your will, you may find that the people you've appointed are no longer appropriate, or they might no longer be with us. There might have also been some conflict in your family, which might mean it's a better idea to appoint professionals instead of family members in that role. If you've got children, what about guardians you've appointed? Often people make their first will when they've had their first child and might appoint grandparents as the guardians. But then as the years pass on, someone might have got older, might no longer be in the right frame of mind or in the right state of health to be able to look after them, and that might be something you need to update. You might have had new arrivals in the family since you made your will. You might now have grandchildren that you'd like to include. What about your beneficiaries? Have their circumstances changed? Is it still appropriate to give them large sums of money outright? Or would it be better to put some kind of trust or control in place so they don't go spending it all on something silly? Talking of trusts, if it's been quite a few years since you updated your will, you might have some outdated trust arrangements in there. You might have trusts that were put in place for inheritance tax purposes that are no longer efficient for that reason. If you have, it's a really good idea to update your will, make sure it's okay. You might want to simplify it because you might not need trusts anymore, or it might be a different type of trust that's more appropriate for you. There's been a lot of changes to inheritance taxes over the last few years, and you want to make sure that your will utilises all those allowances and exemptions that might be available to you and doesn't have anything in there that would stop you getting any allowance that you should get. You might also be concerned now about protecting assets for future generations. So if you've got a spouse, you might be worried about them remarrying and directing assets to another family, another strand of the family. Or you might be worried about future care fees. We can write your will to help protect things against those issues. On one of the earlier slides, I mentioned that some people do not feel it is necessary to make a will, as they think their estate will automatically pass to their family member, especially if they're married, they think it will all go to their spouse. However, if your estate is over 270,000, the intestate rules dictate that the excess in excess of 270,000 has to be divided up between the spouse and any children that there are. Sometimes that's fine, not a problem, but in other situations it's really problematic. Often it's most problematic where there's a second marriage and there's children from the first marriage, or potentially there's children that you're estranged from and you just wouldn't want to receive anything. There's also still this myth about common law marriage, and that if you've been living with someone for a certain amount of time, that then means that you're treated in a certain way as a spouse. That's not the case at all, and under the intestate rules, an unmarried partner is not entitled to anything at all. They might go to court and they might be awarded something, but the stress, the time, the cost of all of that is certainly a barrier, and it's just a lot of hassle that people don't want. It really is best if you write your will and get your wishes known. Whereas your will deals with what happens when you've died, lasting powers of attorney are for use during your lifetime. They allow you to appoint someone or several people to make decisions for you if you're no longer able to yourself. There are two types, and you can only create them whilst you have capacity, so it's certainly something to do sooner rather than later. The first type is property and financial affairs. So that covers anything to do with money, really. So it could be managing your bank account, paying bills for you, making sure you get the benefits that you're entitled to, and it could also include selling your property if there's a need to, so perhaps because you were moving into long-term care. The finance lasting power of attorney can be used when you no longer have capacity to make decisions for yourself, but also if drafted in the right way, it can be used whilst you still have capacity, but maybe need your attorneys to give you a hand with things, so on your instructions they can do things for you. Some of my clients find this really useful, especially if they're having difficulties hearing or physically aren't able to get out and about and would like a hand with things. We get a lot of people who say they don't need this finance lasting power of attorney because they're married and they've got money in joint accounts. However, a lot of the banks have it in their terms and conditions that if one of the co-owners loses capacity, they will then freeze that account and neither of them will be able to have access. It's an important safeguarding measure, but it also can cause problems. This was in the media actually quite recently. I don't know if any of you watch morning TV, but presenter Kate Garraway, her husband was in hospital for about a year with coronavirus, and they didn't have any documents in place such as lasting powers of attorney. Because of this, Kate Garraway was unable to access funds in joint accounts to manage her husband's care, and she was also not able to remortgage their house, which caused them problems. The other type of lasting power of attorney is health and welfare. So this one can only be used if you do not have capacity to make a decision for yourself, and it covers anything from day-to-day decisions all the way up to big decisions like where you're going to live and what kind of medical treatment you might receive. Recent research by Sisters for the Elderly showed that 65% of people think that their next of kin will be able to make medical and care decisions for them if they're no longer able to. That's not the case at all. Without a lasting power of attorney in place, no family member or next of kin has authority to make those types of decisions. In those circumstances, the local authority or the medical professionals would, of course, chat to your loved ones, but if there's a disagreement about what's in your best interests, it would be the local authority or the medical professional who would be making that decision. They would be deciding what's in your best interests. And if they think that's something different to the family, well, that's what's going to happen. We often see conflict in those situations. There's a really important part of the lasting power of attorney that talks about life-sustaining treatment decisions. So I want you to just think for a moment. If you were on a life support machine, who would you want to make that decision about whether it's switched off? If you needed a life-saving operation and you couldn't make that decision for yourself, who would you want to decide whether you have that operation or not? You can give your attorneys authority in the lasting power of attorney to effectively step into your shoes and make those decisions as if they were you, which is a really powerful thing and puts you in control of your future care and potentially your death as well. When making a health and welfare LPA, it's really important to think about what type of care you'd want and then make those wishes known to your attorneys. It's really tricky for them if they don't know what you'd want, but if you tell them what you want, it's a really powerful document to have in place. And we can help you facilitate those conversations. We know it's not always easy, but it's an important conversation to have. Maybe just take a moment to think about what a good death looks like for you. Would you like to die at home? Would you like to die somewhere else? I know I've had clients in the past who've quite liked the idea of going on a cruise ship and that's where they die. Would you like your loved ones present or not? What does a good death look like for you? A survey a few years ago found that only 18% of people have spoken to family members about the way they might want to end their life. And that's something that really needs to change. We all need to get much better at talking about it. We understand the fear people feel, but we can help you explore what a good death looks like for you and help those wishes be fulfilled by putting the right documents in place. For many people, a good death means being with family and friends, being cared for, and able to die in the place of their choice. Lasting powers of attorney must be registered before they can be used, but thousands are rejected every year by the Office of Public Guardian who deals with the registrations, and sometimes at that point of registration it's too late to correct the problems. Because as I said, you have to have capacity when you originally make the documents. Using a specialist lawyer will help ensure the documents are correct to begin with, and that they are drafted to suit your particular circumstances. We create a bespoke document just for you. There's some really important decisions that you need to make as part of making a lasting power of attorney. Who are you going to appoint as your attorneys? How are you going to appoint your attorneys? Are you going to appoint them so they have to do absolutely everything together? Or are you going to allow them to make decisions independently as well, which is often better, a bit more flexible? What about replacement attorneys? Should you have any of those? Should you include any preferences or restrictions or instructions to guide your attorneys when they're acting for you? We can help you make the right decision on all of those different aspects. I'm just going to briefly comment on some related documents that you might have heard of. So one is enduring powers of attorney. These are the old documents that were in place before lasting powers of attorney came in. If you've got one and it was prepared correctly at the time, it is still a valid document. They differ in quite a few ways from the new lasting powers of attorney. Most relevant to our discussions today is probably that it only covers property and financial affairs. It does not cover health and welfare at all. So you might find that making both types of lasting power of attorney and cancelling the old enduring power of attorney is a good way to go. Or you might want to keep the old enduring power of attorney, but then do a health and welfare lasting power of attorney to sit alongside it. I deal a lot with the Court of Protection in my daily work, and that's often where someone has lost capacity and they haven't put any documents such as lasting powers of attorney in place. If you haven't made lasting powers of attorney, you no longer have capacity and someone needs to manage your finances, then someone needs to apply to the Court of Protection to become your deputy instead. The Court of Protection also will get involved with health and welfare decisions sometimes. That's often where there's been a conflict between decision makers and family members. The Court of Protection does have an emergency procedure in place if things need to be dealt with really quickly, but often orders take 6 to 12 months to get through the court. So it's a lot of time, a lot of expense, a lot of stress that can be avoided if you've put documents in place beforehand. There are two other documents that I want to mention just briefly, and they are advanced medical decisions and DNRs. These are really specific documents that set out what you would not want to happen in certain circumstances. So they're very narrow. They can be really useful and they do have their place, but often it's better to make a health and welfare lasting power of attorney. It's much more comprehensive, it covers a lot more things, and then have that conversation with your attorneys about what you would want to happen in certain circumstances. I really believe that planning ahead and putting the right legal documentation in place can help you make the most of your life and spare your loved ones from dealing with difficult decisions on your behalf or dealing with the fallout if you have not got your affairs in order. This is the last slide from me. I just wanted to briefly touch on why it's a good idea to use a lawyer rather than a will writer or doing it yourself. When you use a specialist lawyer, you are benefiting from their experience and expertise. They know how to put people at ease when dealing with complex and life-changing decisions and issues. And you will have the peace of mind that they are regulated and insured if anything were to go wrong. It is worth looking out for membership of places like Society of Tax and Estate Practitioners, known as STEP, and Solicitors for the Elderly, often referred to as just SFE. Also look out for things like Dementia Friends and membership of local dementia-friendly communities to make sure you've got someone who's well versed with dealing with issues around death and care. Using a specialist lawyer will also help you protect your legal documents against future challenges because they'll have made sure you've got the mental capacity in place when you make them. Okay, that's it from me. I'm going to hand over to Jo, who's going to talk about funerals.
Hello everyone, thank you to Karen and Becca for inviting me here today. I'm Jo Williamson and I own and run Albany Funerals, which is a company based in Maidstone and Ashford. We've been going for about 10 years And we specialise in not only providing traditional funerals, but also more modern funerals. If we can move on to the next slide, thank you. So, as both Karen and Becca have said previously today, we're not very good at talking about death in this country, and we're made to feel it's somehow wrong to talk about our funeral, and that means that we're not very well prepared when it happens to us, and all of us will be affected by the death of a close family member, or in fact for preparing our own death. So I always find that actually people do want to talk about death, because when I tell them what I do, they come forward with many stories and they really enjoy talking about their experiences and being able to open up. So it is something that I'm passionate about helping people with, to feel that it's okay to talk about. So I'd like to give you some information today, and I'm going to start with dispelling some funeral myths that we hear quite a lot. So if we can move to the first one, please. Thank you. So people are made to feel I should have a funeral plan, and I want to explain that you don't have to have one of these to be prepared. In fact, funeral plans are asking for money up front, and personally I don't believe that this needs to be done in this way. I think about things, talk to your relatives, and sometimes it's just one thing that you would like, maybe just a song that you'd really like, and then if a family comes to me and they say, well, we know Dad really wanted this song, we can build a funeral around that one thing. Or you might even just know what you don't want. You really don't want this, or you really don't want that. It's really helpful to plan ahead. Without getting a funeral plan, we provide funeral wishes forms, and you can get a form as well on the Dying Matters website. They have some very good forms on there, and it can be used as a discussion point to just have a chat. You don't have to go on and on. Have a chat, write it down, put it away, and get on with your lives. Also, something we hear a lot, people feel you have to go to the funeral director that's on your doorstep. And this isn't the case. You can go anywhere. And I think it's really helpful to have a little look about the funeral directors that are local to you. Maybe phone them up, have a chat, look at their website, do a bit of research when you're well and you don't need a funeral director, so that you can then put it away again and you don't have to think about it. But you've done that research at a time when you're feeling, you know, in a good place and you're not bereaved or about to be bereaved. And you can really look for someone who you get a feeling with, you feel you can trust them and you feel comfortable with. Also, don't hesitate to travel a little bit if you feel you've seen a nice one that's not completely in your area. So again, some people feel they don't want a funeral. They feel it's a very negative thing. They don't want to talk about a funeral when they're faced with losing a loved one. And I just wanted to say that if it's done properly, and if you're talking to someone who can really try and understand what your needs are, it can be such a healing part of the grieving process. It's a good funeral is not a bad thing. I hear all the time, oh, I feel bad saying it was a good funeral, or I feel bad saying it was a good day, because in spite of the grief and the sadness, it can be a very, very good thing to have a healing funeral. So a funeral does not have to be held in a church or a crematorium. More and more, we're helping families find different venues to hold a funeral and celebrate the lives of their loved ones. I'll talk a bit more about this later on, because it's really, I think, something that's changing the face of funerals today. And it's allowing people to have a bit more time, a bit more space, and go somewhere that actually means something to them. So we'll come onto this a bit more in a moment. Sometimes a funeral's not the right thing at all for a family. I had a call yesterday from a person whose dad is end of life care in a care home, and they all felt very strongly they did not want a funeral at all. And this was discussed with the person years previously. They knew that's what they wanted to do. They didn't know it was possible. They phoned me up and I explained to them it was very possible. So no one will be attending the cremation when the time comes. That's not necessarily disrespectful or anything like that. The family can hold something together. They're going to get together, have a lovely meal together, talk about the person, share stories, share photos. A funeral can be not a funeral, but you're still remembering your loved one and still honouring them. So this one makes me smile. I often hear, you don't look like a funeral director. And I suppose I take that as a compliment, because we do see some quite strange looking funeral directors, very Victorian. What I would say is make sure you find a funeral director when you need one that you feel comfortable with and that you feel you can trust. It's really, really important. It's a very, very important thing. You're buying, it's a product. It's very, very important to research it properly, and don't go with someone if you feel they don't look like you would like them to look. So coming back to what I was talking about earlier about being able to hold a funeral in other venues, I just wanted to show you a few examples of a few funerals that we have done. I have permission to share these photos with you, and most of them don't contain photos of people. It's often the setup that we've photographed just to show you what you can do. And a funeral, everyone's different, and there's no such thing as a one size fits all. So what we do is we work with families to find what really works for them. So if we move on to the first picture, this was a funeral that took place in a beautiful venue in Wye near Ashford. The person that died was actually formerly quite a well-known pop star, and they wanted something different. They didn't want to go to the crematorium. They weren't religious, so they didn't feel comfortable going to a church. So we worked together. We found this venue, and actually they all used to walk their dogs there when they were younger, and so it had a lot of meaning for them there. We had an outdoor ceremony, which was very formal, so it was very much the same kind of format that you would have in a crematorium. But it was outside. We had music. There was time for anyone who wanted to say something to stand up and say something. After the service, they all went inside and had lunch together, and then they came and wrote messages on the cardboard coffin at the end, and it was really, really lovely. So move on to the next one. So this was actually a very traditional funeral. It was in a church, but the family wanted something a little bit different because their mum was such a huge character. And they jokingly said, oh, mum would just love a jazz band walking up the road. So we said, yeah, fine, let's do it. So the jazz band walked up the road to the church, playing their jazz all the way into the church. And it was really great. So we move on to the next one. Now this funeral took place in a beautiful stately home near London. The lady that died lived in Ashford, but all her family lived in London, and they were all sort of scattered around, and they wanted something a bit different. So in this venue, they actually chose to hold the funeral service after the cremation, and the person's ashes were present with some beautiful photos. We had all sorts of boards, we had flowers, we had objects that she had loved. And again, the room was set up quite formally. The funeral took place in this venue, and then they had a lovely lunch served afterwards. Move on to the next one. This is a venue in Bilsington. It's the Priory, so it's a bit church-like, but it's very intimate space, and we've held quite a lot of funerals in there, and it's really, really beautiful. Next one, please. This was one of the first funerals that we did in this way, and the lady had loved going to this particular pub for lunches with a glass of rosé was her favourite thing. So we explored options, and in the end we were very lucky with the weather, and we were able to have a beautiful funeral on their decking, again with ashes present, which was preferable, and it also to the family, but it also opens up more venues, more choice of venues. So they had a fantastic time. There's another photo later which I'll show you, but they all had a glass of rosé during the service, and it was just lovely to see everyone smiling. If we move on to the next one. This is back to the Y venue, just to show you the setup while we were waiting for the coffin to arrive and the guests. It just shows you what you can do. On to the next one. This was a natural burial. So we're running out of space in cemeteries in this country, and a really good alternative is a natural burial. There aren't any headstones. The body is buried in a very natural coffin, and this particular family weren't quite so lucky with the weather, but the lady walking at the back, it was her mother's funeral, and the only people present were her and her two sons, and she wrote the whole service with poetry, and it was really beautiful. We had music by the graveside, and then they went home and had some lunch together. We move on to the next one. This was a family who the father had died whilst abroad, and they couldn't repatriate his body, so he was cremated abroad, and they then had a beautiful service in a pub they liked, who had a marquee in the back, and they had beautiful lunch, and they did a balloon release after the service. Again, ashes only present for that one. Another natural burial, better weather this time, with dog present as well, requested by the family. Move on. Now, this we also do small and more intimate services at our premises if that fits for the family. This particular one, they wanted an informal setup, so we had the coffin in the other side of the room, but we left sofas and chairs so that they could sit comfortably with a cup of tea. And the celebrant had that bowl of water that you can see. It was a beautiful bowl, and during the ceremony she lit floating candles and put them in the bowl, and it was very intimate and very lovely. They had as much time as they liked, and after that they all had a cup of tea, and then they went on to have some lunch again. Moving on to the next one. Another setup at our premises, but for more people, with candles, flowers. Again, the coffin was there, the celebrant gave a service, and again, a very intimate way of doing it. This is coming back to the previous slide I showed you. These are the people with their glass of wine, of rosé, listening to the celebrant giving a service, and we had a queue of people at the end of that saying, that's what I want for my funeral. Often it can be a bit of a leap of faith, because we're nervous that what will other people think. But every single time we've done a funeral like this, we've had nothing but good comments from all the people that have come along. Again, this is Bilsington, a setup with the celebrant practicing before the service. You can see all the flowers, and that can be totally bespoke. However the family wants it set up, we can do it. So this last slide is following on from the Y funeral. And here you have a family just gathered around the coffin, reading the comments. the lady that is leaning on the coffin, before she came up, she was in tears, not wanting to go up to the coffin and didn't know what to write. And by the end of it, she felt so comfortable. She was just leaning on it, which I found really touching, and I think it helped them a lot. Obviously, you don't have to do that, but that's something that you can do, and it is possible. Just to summarise, really, so a coffin can be held anywhere, particularly if you choose not to have the coffin present. Now, some people really feel they want the coffin to be there, and others actually don't like the idea of staring at a coffin. So that, again, is absolutely up to you, something that you can choose or your loved ones can choose. So what I'd like to say is we're all going to, like I said before, we're all going to be faced with this awful thing of having to arrange a funeral. So don't forget that you will feel more empowered if you know a little bit about what the person wants, or if you communicate a little bit what you want or don't want to your family members, so that they're empowered to know what they need to do, and they're not second guessing what you would have wanted. It's not wrong or morbid to get this information before you need it, but it's good to do a bit of research and then just put it to one side for when you do need it. So I felt I ought to say a little word about the effect of COVID on funerals, because there's been a lot of this in the press lately, and so you're probably familiar that there has been a big effect on funerals during the pandemic. At the beginning, they were almost stopped altogether, down to 10 people. Then went up to 30, and then from next week, you probably know that restrictions are being lifted further. But what I'd like to say is the pandemic did force us to look at funerals differently. I worked with a lot of people who normally would have done something very traditional, and they had to kind of think outside the box and do something else. And we've even done virtual events that were actually so much better than you would have imagined. So I feel that there is something slightly positive that's come out of this, is that we are beginning to see funerals differently, and that's a really good thing in my opinion. So to finish off, technology has been such a frustrating but useful tool during the pandemic. Even when we were really stretched, we were able to send paperwork by computer. We were able to have Zoom calls with families. We even had a Zoom funeral. Live streaming at funerals became the norm, even though some crematoria before the pandemic didn't even have the facility to do this. Now it's become a real, a really commonly used tool. People from Australia or New Zealand or America or Europe just dialing into the funeral, and actually having watched many streamed funerals, it's actually really is the next best thing to being there in person. So I really hope that we keep some of these good things going forward, and thank you for your time. I hope you found this helpful. Do feel free to ask me any questions and we can answer them in the Q&A session.
That's great. Thank you very much, Jo, and Becca too. So we have had some questions come in. If I just read them out to begin with. So the first one is, good morning. I'm 71, have a will and power of attorney for financial and welfare matters. My estate's retracting tax. Should I prepay for my funeral? So that sort of covers both elements really. It affects the will instructions, but also thinking about the funeral. So Becca, do you want to what do you want to say? What do you think about that from the will side of things? And then maybe Jo, you can add in about the funeral side.
Yeah, so it's something that comes up quite a lot when we're drafting up wills. People worry about how their funeral is going to be paid for, and whether there's going to be any money available for it before there's a grant of probate or anything like that obtained. And a lot of people don't realise that if there's enough money in a bank account, the banks will pay out directly to the funeral directors to make sure that that funeral invoice is paid straight away, and people aren't waiting for that or having to put it on credit cards or anything like that.
Absolutely. Also, I would add, I agree with Becca, not many people do realise that, but it's actually the easiest way to pay for a funeral. The bank, as long as you present a death certificate and an invoice from a funeral director to the bank, they will directly pay the funeral director. I don't think anyone should prepay for their funeral because things can change, businesses can change, you're locked into a particular funeral director. I think it's more important to just make sure that if you have any particular wishes, just make sure they're recorded.
Yeah, great, thank you. And the other point there about the inheritance tax side of things, it doesn't make any difference as to whether you prepay for the funeral or not, because the funeral expense is deductible against the estate inheritance tax purposes. So again, so hopefully that answers that question. But if not, please do get in touch with the contact details at the end. I've got another question here. Hello, I'm 56. I have a will with a trust fund for my son and also my daughter, who is profoundly disabled. If circumstances don't change, how often should I review my will with our solicitors? Becca, what do you want to say about that?
We normally recommend that you review your will every 2 to 3 years, or before that if something has happened, like a death or a marriage, some other kind of significant event. Yeah, definitely have a look at it every few years. It might be that it's fine and it doesn't need to be changed, or it might be that we need to update it a little bit.
Yes, I definitely agree, particularly if you have a trust in there, because there's all sorts of reasons to incorporate a trust, personal circumstances, but also tax circumstances, and tax circumstances have a habit of being changed sort of from time to time. So do keep an eye on that, and at White Moncton we offer a review service whereby we will sit down with clients for half an hour and just review that will, just to flag up to see if there's anything that's changing. Also, we actually run something called the Legal Review Program, where clients have trusts in their wills, and for an annual fee, on an annual basis, report back to you as to whether there have been any changes in the tax side of things, or the trust side of things, that might mean that you have to update things. So if that's something you're interested in, just sort of get in touch. But definitely read the will every year, make sure it still says what you wanted to say, and then every 3 to 5 years, sit down with your solicitor and have a good look through it, just to make sure that there's another question that's come in. Hi, thank you for the clear explanation on the dying topic. May I know the cost of writing a will, please? Yeah, that's absolutely fine. So that's why £350 HCAT is the will, £500 and we have different entities who have trusts, so you can check that out on the website. But hopefully that answers your query for that. Let me just see if there's anything else that's come in. That's all of the questions there. What about lasting powers of attorney, Becca? We're often asked, how do I update the lasting powers of attorney?
So if attorneys have moved address, it's a good idea to let the Office of the Public Guardian know, just so the documents are up to date. But if you want to actually update your document in that you want to change who your attorneys are, If you want to add any more on, you'd have to start again from scratch with a new document. If you find that you've got attorneys on there who you no longer think are appropriate and you want to remove, then that's normally a bit more straightforward, and we can do a partial or a complete revocation to cancel out the document. And you can do that anytime you've got capacity. So it's not completely set in stone. You can change it if you need to.
Great, thank you. So yeah, it's a good idea to keep that under review then as well, isn't it? As well as the will, think about the powers of attorney at the same time, make sure they're up to date. Let's have a look. Is it possible to get a copy of the slides and who to contact for will writing? Yeah, I think, Becky, we've got a slide here with our contact details, haven't we, at the end? So we'll put that up in a minute, and you can take a photo if you want to get our email addresses. But also you can check out the White Hamilton website for more information. And yes, we will, if you want a copy of the slides, just email us and then we can get that sent out to you. How much does it cost to rewrite a will? That's really the same as writing a will in the first place. We can do small amendments by way of a codicil. They used to be very popular sort of years and years ago when wills were handwritten. And as you can imagine, if you simply wanted to amend a small thing, it meant having to write out the whole thing again. So that's why codicils will be quite popular. But these days, when we type wills and keep the documents on file, there's no need to actually draft a whole new codicil document. So, you know, speak to us as part of the review process, and we can let you know if it's going to be the cost of a new will, or whether we can, if it's a very small amendment and we've got the document in the file, we can charge you the cost of a codicil even though we don't actually draft a codicil. But to be honest, there isn't a huge difference in price, because we like to be really thorough and go through with our clients all of the personal circumstances, the financial circumstances as well, before we write a will for a client. So there's just as much work involved in making a will as there is for that. So please do check it out. Just double check, see if there's any other questions that have come in. Nothing else from the webinar today. Were there any other points? I think, Becky, you had an interesting question that you were asked recently about the funeral side of things.
Yes, so I had a client the other day who was very concerned about being cremated and it not being very good for the environment, because he felt that he had to go through an embalming process. And I think Joe will be able to comment on this a bit more, but he didn't realise that that didn't have to happen, and there's a choice as to whether you're embalmed or not.
Absolutely. So, yes, absolutely. So, embalming really, I think, is becoming less and less common as funeral directors have better facilities with refrigerated facilities. It's quite an invasive procedure, and there's also a lot of chemicals involved. So it's not something that I personally feel is very necessary or should be done. And I feel that people should know that it's a choice, and if they have a funeral director that is telling them the body has to be embalmed, then that should be a red flag. It's really something that we would only do if there's a repatriation from abroad of the body, or whether people want to spend a lot of time perhaps with the body or have the body brought home, then perhaps then it's a good idea, because it does preserve the body, but it's not something that has to happen, and it's totally a choice.
Great, thank you. Thanks for answering that. Let me just, is there a guideline features for preparing a power of attorney, please? Yes, we do have all of the fees again are set out on the website, because we have different fees depending on whether you're a couple or a single person, whether you're making one type of attorney, power of attorney, or both types, and then also whether you're registering. because as Becca said earlier, the second part of the process of making the power of attorney, the lasting power of attorney, is to register it. But some people don't choose to register it straight away, so we split our fees up on that basis. For example, if you're younger and your children are still quite young, but you want to have a power of attorney in place just in case something happens to you, but ultimately you want to appoint your children to be your attorneys, then you may make one power of attorney now, appointing other relatives, family, friends, but don't actually register it. And then when your children are older, you make another power of attorney and appoint them, and then you register that one. So we like to give clients the option as to what they do and how they do it, and that is all set out on our website under the power of attorney section. If you want to email us directly, we can send you the link. If you can't find it on the website, just let us know and we can send you that brochure. Let me just check if there's anything else that's come in. No, that's it for the questions. Becca and Jo, is there anything else you wanted to raise as part of the panel discussion?
No, I think I've said everything. I would just add, yes, there is one thing. Obviously, I've showed a lot of examples of different funerals, but that doesn't mean that a traditional funeral is a wrong thing to do. We also do very traditional funerals too, so it's all about giving you a choice, really.
Thank you. Actually, one question I was going to ask you, Jo, was how do you go about finding the right celebrant? Is it through you as the director, or do you approach them directly? What's the story?
So again, there's two ways really of doing it. Sometimes people find the celebrant first and then come to us, or they come to us and we have some trusted celebrants that we will then put them in touch with, depending on what sort of person they want. But there's no rule. And again, I would say, as a rule, if you phone a funeral, you talk to a funeral director and they say you can't use a different celebrant that you have been in contact with, that's another red flag, I would say, because there's no rule about who can find a celebrant. So, and often celebrants, that families come to funerals to us through the celebrant, because the celebrant has then recommended to use us. So lots of celebrants have their own websites and they get people looking at their profiles and phoning them up directly as well. So it's really both.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks. Right, so there's no other questions. So I think that we'll work to a close. But thank you very much to everyone for joining us today. Hopefully you've managed to get a copy of our contact details there. But if not, just get in touch with us and we can send you the slides. Thanks again for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Bye.